Hi, Doug and Colleen and Erica. Welcome to the podcast. We can't wait to talk to you all today about some topics that we feel like sometimes get lost in the conversations, the science of reading conversations, specifically around comprehension. So we're really excited. Thank you all for being here.
We're really happy to be here too.
Thanks so much for having us.
Excited to be here. Thank you both.
All right, so today we want to talk about texts. Specifically, what text should students be reading in the classrooms and how teachers can help students read these texts. And one really important thing to note is that we want to focus on reading entire books. That's what this conversation is going to be about. Doug, you referred to this as the hidden tragedy that reading entire books are disappearing from schools. So I thought we could start by talking about what you notice. What do you all notice happening in classrooms if students aren't reading whole books? And how did we get away from this? Because I know I remember reading full books when I was in school.
Well, and ironically, I think so many parents are not aware of this, that they imagine their kids in school reading books cover to cover. And I'm so grateful to you guys for doing this episode because I think it's one of the saddest and most important things that's like an almost unacknowledged change in reading instruction in schools. How do we get away from it? I think books have gotten harder to read. One of the things we talk about in the book is the decline of students' attention, but really our attention, right? Reading is such an attentionally demanding exercise, and you have to use sustained focus attention in class and after school, really, because you're supposed to read at home. And we know that the cell phone has degraded people's attention spans. It's an attention fracturing machine. And one of the outcomes of this is steep decline in reading behaviors outside of the classroom. It used to be, let's say 20 years ago, you could bet on having 3 times as many kids in a typical, say, 5th or 6th grade classroom who read every day compared to kids who never read. And those percentages are flipped now. Right now, you're likely to have 2 to 3 times as many kids who never read as opposed to kids who are regular readers. So, it's more challenging to get kids to read the book and be able to sustain their focus on the book. I think a second issue is, I think that people have come to believe maybe in some ways that the text is irrelevant sometimes, that there's so much focus on what we call skillsiness, which is like the purpose of reading instruction is to teach kids how to make an inference. And so I'm going to describe inferences in 7 steps, and we're going to spend 45 minutes practicing making inferences. And that, first of all, I think that that's unscientific, that making 100 inferences from Tuck Everlasting will not prepare you to read Oliver Twist. That, I know you've had Daniel Willingham on the show, and he says that how we're thinking is domain specific, that we think deeply about what we have background knowledge on. There's a beautiful conversation between you and him about disambiguating text and how that happens through background knowledge. But I think that when you imagine reading as an endeavor that is made up of skills, the next step is to think, well, the book doesn't really matter. I can really practice my skills in almost any setting. All texts are more or less interchangeable. Gee, why don't I choose a book that will be super entertaining for kids like Captain Underpants, and then they'll really love that. And then the last thing that I hope is true is that part of it is just lack of understanding about how important books are and the science behind books, because that's kind of where we go in our chapter, which is there are a lot of reasons scientifically why books are the optimal setting for reading. And so maybe those are 3 reasons why the text has been crowded out by short informational passages. And when students do read, it's oftentimes they're sent to the corners of the classroom to read a book on their own, and that can be lovely. We don't know much about what's happening in that setting, and there isn't much social interaction between kids or between kids and teacher around the text. And we really believe that a text is a social thing.
Yeah, and I just wanted to jump in with, I don't want to make teachers feel like we're blaming them, like they're the ones that are making this happen, because I'm thinking back even when I was in school, although I did read some whole books, we also had those textbooks, which inherently are just short stories. And I remember seeing excerpts of a play, it would be one act of a play. And you're like, well, what's the point? I want to see what happens. And then I also remember in Baltimore, this was about 10 years ago, we looked at the curriculum that we created in Baltimore, and there was a high school that was using an excerpt from Holes, the book Holes. And I'm like, well, I love the book Holes, but 1, I would question it being in a high school, but 2, what's the point of reading just a chunk of that book? You want to read the whole book. And then there's curriculum today that's on the market that lots of schools are adopting that use excerpts of text. So I just wanted to put that out there that this is something that's been happening, still happening, not something that teachers are doing wrong.
Yeah, totally agree. And I'm really glad you said that, because we want to distinguish between the situation that teachers are in. They rarely have full control of their own curriculum, and and I know that many teachers want to read books and yearn to read books. And one thing we'd like to do is give them the support of science to say, you're right, keep going with it. It's worth the struggle.
Melissa, I'm so glad you mentioned that too, though, because sort of it's important to think about why books have started to disappear from the classroom. And we do believe deeply in the power of and the importance of, state assessments to hold schools accountable to make sure that they are high quality and meeting the needs of every student. But I think what's happened in this era of high stakes testing, that the tail has begun to wag the dog a bit, and that the reason, and actually my son's AP Lit teacher from last year coined this the passive education of the English class. And oftentimes it's kind of a sin of enthusiasm on behalf of schools wanting to make sure that students get enough practice so that they feel prepared for the test, and of course so that they as a school do better on the test. But to Doug's point, that's not the effective way to teach reading. It doesn't matter how many passages you get to identify main idea. To do it in a complex setting will always prove a stumbling block, and actually having a deep relationship with one text is actually proven to be much more effective in preparing a student to be able to do that than just with these death by passage, as you might call it. So you're absolutely right, Melissa, that this is not teachers being like, ooh, we're going to do passages instead, but rather just the dynamic that's been set up in education. And it's much more detrimental on the reading side even than the math side, because on the math side, actually that frequent practice is important to create that automaticity, but it just doesn't work the same way in reading, as you guys both know.
Yeah, and Erica, I'm wondering if we can dig in there where you just talked about the benefits of reading a full text. So what do you feel like what do you all know students gain from reading a full text versus these shorter passages?
We talk about this a lot, and I think that we know that increasingly in our society, the hot take has become our primary mode of communication, and we don't need to go deep on the problems. I think that is causing us as a culture and society. And I think that what's happened is that we have now replaced the sort of this hot take with valuing deep and reflective thought. Really thinking through a complex issue, being able to develop your thinking over time, being able to go back and say, here's what I originally thought, and actually here's how my thinking has changed. And actually maybe there was a moment when I was actually even maybe wrong in my initial argument. And so we think that books can be the antidote in society as this sort of helping to reshape the way that we think about communication with each other and then conversation. We just think that it's really beautiful to experience in the reading of a book the full range of a character's triumphs and tragedies. We think it's especially powerful when you can experience that with your peers and your teacher. Doug talked about the reading of a book as a social experience. And then you can observe and discuss changes that happen to a character within a book over the course of the book unfolding. It's not a process that happens quickly. It's a process that happens really slowly. And so there's a lot of empathy building that also happens because you start to understand the full range of experiences and the complexity of being a human.
I love the point that you're making now. I was just going to chime in to say something really obvious about books, which is that a protagonist never believes at the end of the book what they believed at the beginning. It's always about careful analysis and perspective change and belief change. I just think it's so important, as Colleen alluded to, at a time when the message is, you can understand the world in 128 characters pretty easily. You're probably right. Just whatever your hunch is, you're probably right. And I think just long form narratives undercut that expectation, and it's really important. Can I throw out one or two other just benefits to, are you going to keep going, Driggs? Okay. I think there's there's a lot of research around the idea that books are cognitively privileged, that stories are cognitively privileged, that when we hear information in expository form and when we hear it in the form of a story, we remember it better in a story. Stories are familiar to us, right? They reduce the extraneous cognitive load because we kind of know what the conventions are and how things will work. And so we're able to just pay attention more to what we're learning, and especially often build a bit of an emotive Daniel Willingham, this phrase, he uses the word psychologically privileged, but it's a little bit clearer to me what he means by that. If we just say cognitively privileged, we learn more when we read stories, especially when we build a relationship to the narrator and their perspective. I was just reading Ian McEwan's book Atonement. And for the first 60 pages, I kind of was not that into it, if I'm honest. Like, I was counting the pages and I was like, I'm on page 58, and then suddenly I looked down and I was on page 106, and then suddenly I looked down, and I was on, page 206 or whatever like that. And I think that the other thing that happens when you read long form is that it's always a little bit of a struggle to enter the world that the author is creating, and it takes some patience. And then you're richly rewarded for it. And I think that's a really important message for young people, which is it doesn't come easily, that some insights are worth struggling for. And maybe just a last point I'd make is cultural capital, which is books are the medium in which the most important ideas have been captured and expressed in our society for hundreds of years. When you go to college or out into the world, people will, if you've read 1984 and you know a little bit about what Orwellian means, or you've read Lord of the Flies, right, you're more able to participate in cultural conversations about meaningful ideas, and that's a gift to students to do this. And so there are 4 ideas in there. Colleen's idea, the medium is the message, cognitive endurance, stories are cognitively privileged, and there's cultural capital in books. It's really important.
Yeah, I was a former middle school and high school teacher, so all of this is like, I'm like over here cheerleading. Yes, this is exactly right. I am curious, though. A lot of our listeners are, lower elementary teachers, and I'm wondering about that. Like, would a picture book fall under this same category that we're talking about, or would reading aloud an even longer text be beneficial?
Yeah, I would say absolutely. So when we talk about, sometimes Doug will use the language like the book is dead. That is really more in the middle to upper grades. I think the beauty, and this is certainly true in my own household, the book was not dead when they were in kindergarten through, 6th grade. It was sort of once the device started entering the sort of the inclination to pick up a book, whether that be at home or even in the classroom, has started to dwindle. The first chapter of our book really talks about the importance of attention building, and how, that's one of the challenges that we face, that even as adult readers, Doug, your story, we won't tell Ian McEwan how you initially felt about his book, but most adult readers might not even relate to that, because on page 5 they would have picked up their cell phone, or they would have, oh, what's this that I want to look up, and now I'm 5 web pages in. So it really is more of an upper and middle grade challenge that we face. And I think the focus also shifts. So, building that joy in those early grades, building the importance of, to your point, Melissa, the read aloud in order to build fluency and to support student comprehension. Continuing that practice as the grades progress is just so incredibly important. And in fact, we have in addition to the book, That Guide to the Science of Reading, we have a middle grades curriculum. It's currently 5 through 8 with a couple books that we're starting for high school, but it's book based for this very reason. Just that we want to make sure that we are reconnecting students to the relationship that they can have with the book. And one of the important pieces there is it's not only the joy they find in the book, but the comprehension. Doug, I love the points you made about how a character can evolve, how our relationship with the text can evolve over the course of reading about it. And one of the ways that we do it, both in the TLAC Guide to the Science of Reading, but also in our curriculum more broadly, is just how important knowledge is. So it's not only reading the book that you're reading, but also supplementing it with the important knowledge that students need in order to access it.
Yeah, that's such a good point. Before I comment, does anyone want to add to that? I'll go for it. So you're making me think, Erica, I have a 7th grader myself. I'm sorry, an 8th grader now. Incorrect. And last year she read Lord of the Flies. And she was reading the book. She was like, I like this book. It's really interesting. And they did a whole thing on society and all the dystopian things you would do with a book like that. But they also read other books as well. And when she got to the end of the book, she was like, I liked it, but it wasn't my favorite to talk about dystopian societies. But she was able to explain why. And she was really proud of herself for reading it. So Doug, to your point, she got through it. And I would even say joyfully got through it, because she was just doing a lot of discussion with her peers. But the thing, too, that she was really proud of was what they did in class with that book. And she ended up writing a 4-page paper in response to a topic and learning a whole lot about how to write an essay and good skills you need for the future. But I think sometimes we forget that you can't it's hard to write a 4-page paper when the thing you read is 4 pages. Do you know what I mean? Like if you have read a whole book, you could write in 7th grade, you can write a 4-page paper with guidance and support from your teacher. It's very difficult to do that if the thing that you read isn't bulky enough in terms of concepts, ideas, text to do that. So I just wanted to add that. You only read a chapter. Correct. You're really going to be lost in that one. But I just wanted to add that.
Yeah, Colleen talks about that all the time, how it's really important that the books be worthy of analysis. But I just want to linger for a minute on your daughter's surprise, right? That and so she's proud of herself for having done something hard, for having read something challenging, for something that she knows is meaningful, and then to find herself. I would love it if kids loved the books that we read, but to have them walking away having written a 4-page cohesive argument to be able to articulate a series of very complex ideas about the book, even if it's to say this is why I wasn't that crazy about the book and I don't like dystopian fiction, victory.
Totally, exactly.
So books are the place in which substance is explored. There really isn't another way to communicate that level of substance. And you could say, well, could you write a 4-page paper about a movie? Yeah, you probably could. But there's something about the durability of a book, and that you can go back and you can look at the author's exact words and examine them and continue to refresh your working memory of those concepts. That's really important, and I do think is one of the messages that kids take away from school, which is I wasn't sure I wanted to read it. I wasn't always sure during it that I wanted to read it. I read it. I understand it. I'm really proud of it. And then I wrote a really good argument about it. And I accomplished something that means something in school. People like to have done meaningful things.
Yes. And I mean, yes, obviously it was in school, right? It would be a different thing if she were reading at home. We wouldn't have had that same dialogue. I don't think she would have felt as proud, because I think part of it was the collaboration, as you all said, with her classmates, that conversation and really digging out the key ideas there. So I think the next question that I want to ask you all, because I think that this conversation is getting at that, is that you say in your book, you say, quote, a lot of books thoughtfully chosen, read together, and discussed as a class. Right. So as a teacher, I think, what are we looking for in these books that we're choosing? Are there certain qualities, and why would we choose some books over others?
Lori, to your point on your daughter's experience about writing the 4-page paper, it's interesting because when we were writing a TLAC Guide to the Science of Reading, we really struggled with whether or not it was going to be Reading Reconsidered 2.0. But we also wanted to just take advantage of this moment within the science of reading. And again, I think one of the things that made our book so different from Reading Reconsidered was this real emphasis on the research. But in our first version of the book, we really, really emphasized the importance of writing. And I think one of the things that you describe is just the indelible connection between reading and writing, and how it offers a mentor text really for students. And then Melissa, you were sort of joking, but how do you write a 4-page paper on a 1-page article? The other piece there is my own. So this is actually my 7th grader, so a year younger than yours, but a similar exercise, but it was in science class. So it was a science article, a science video, and then he had to answer a series of questions. And I actually think that they're able to do this in other classrooms. And so in middle and high school, it really should be reserved for, again, this emotional connection with one single book for all the reasons that we've described. But then now you're mentioning this idea of which books, which is a complicated question to ask. But I think Doug or Colleen, one of you guys could kick us off just with the idea. I think first and foremost for us is text complexity, and being thoughtful about exposing students to complex texts, because on their own, Doug, you alluded to the SpongeBob or the, Captain Underpants or whatever it is. If those are the books they're going to flock to and they're going to find joy out of, then it's our responsibility to bring in more rigorous texts to ensure that they can also have those effective relationships with Lord of the Flies, and conquer them themselves. So Doug or Driggs, I'll let you take the canonical question there.
Do you want me to go, Driggs, or do you want to jump in first?
I'm thinking I know you love to talk about the canonical texts. One of the things that's really important to me when we're thinking about, we did this when we were thinking about choosing books for our curriculum, is we know the relationship between knowledge and comprehension. And so we want to be thoughtful about what are the books or the portfolio of books that are going to help us to build students' background knowledge, specifically thinking about a breadth of background knowledge, so that they can use that knowledge that we build through the reading of these books to fuel their comprehension of future texts. And so I think one of the things that happens to teachers is they so earnestly want to inspire their kids to read more that they say, great, do you love to read about sports? That's fine. You can read as many books as you want to read about sports, and that's fine. But I think what we start to then shy away from is putting books in front of kids that are going to offer them rich opportunity to build new networks of knowledge, again, that are going to support their comprehension and their understanding of future books that they read. And as importantly, the building of knowledge in new contexts about things that they might not have known about previously, we actually start to build their interest and engagement and curiosity in areas that they hadn't previously known about. And so just because they love sports doesn't necessarily mean that they're not interested in nature or space. They might be, they just don't know it yet. And so I think that we have a real responsibility as teachers and parents to think about, great, so what's a new topic or what, a book, what's a new topic in a book that my kids might be exposed to that might generate this new interest that is going to fuel lots more curiosity and lots more reading on a topic that was previously unknown to them.
I was going to throw out a couple of just rules for choosing a book. One is it should be pretty hard. I mean, it shouldn't be like impossible, but it should actually be pretty hard, because part of the benefit of reading it together as a group is that you, with the support of your teacher, you learn that you can handle things that are harder than you initially thought. That is the fundamental experience of being, in a college or university. Is like I remember being in the basement of some university building trying to read The Sound and the Fury and being like, this makes no sense. And then eventually it does. But the part of the way you get there is by having engaged in productive struggle, ideally with the support of an adult who kind of guides you through and understands how you make meaning when meaning is difficult. And it's not just because you want to read The Sound and the Fury in the basement of your dorm room, but if you like anything, a contract, a legal document, a scientific, pit of research, we have to be able to struggle with hard. And the other thing about hard is that I think one of the most overlooked things in reading is complex syntax, and how so many students can read well when the sentences are simple, but you come up against something that's written in multi-clausal structure with the subject and the object reversed, and suddenly everything falls apart. So being exposed to complex text is important. And it should be great. The book should really, really be great, because one of the messages is you struggled through it. It was hard, but it was great in the end. And you had these thoughts that you didn't know that you would have. See further, your daughter with Lord of the Flies. And I just think it's really important to remember that with the decline of reading outside of school, hopefully we will be able to change it, but it is an inexorable and demonstrable social trend. For many students, the books that they read with us, the 12 books, the 20 books they read in school, will be the only books that they read cover to cover. That is really sad to acknowledge, but it also reminds us how important those book choices are, and we should be choosing great books. And one of the criteria for what is great, tested by time, is a pretty good proxy that people for 50 years have been thinking, wow, Lord of the Flies, this book is really great. That's something that it doesn't mean that every book has to be old, but it's something we shouldn't dismiss out of hand, right? That tells us something.
Doug, I just have to say you brought me back to my college days in my Chaucer class. It was the exact experience that I had, which at the beginning I was just like, I want to drop this class. This is like a whole new language. I have no idea what's going on. But then, the teacher helped me through it, and by the end, it was like, these are actually fun little stories.
I dropped a class in college because the reading was. I was like, oh, I should be a doctor probably, and I took a bio class, and I had never really read any scientific text before, and they sent me down to the science library to read a couple of, and I was like, that's over. And ironically, I became an English major. Anyway, but you should not be scared. People should not be scared of difficulty. It is it's part of our duty to young people to help them understand how to struggle and actually be gratified in the end that they persisted.
Yeah, for sure. Learning is not only hard, but really messy. And it's never a straight line. It's always all over the place. I think the thing that I'm thinking about now is if I'm a teacher listening and I am given books to read, I don't have the freedom to choose. Like, what do I do there? How do I bring the spirit of this conversation to my curriculum? And I know there are so many. I think it's so important that like whatever you're presenting to your students should be with the utmost energy, right? I mean, that's your energy they mimic. So if you're really bummed about reading Lord of the Flies and it's in your curriculum, they're also going to be really bummed. It's funny. I teach at the gym. I teach classes at the gym, and the muscle groups that are the hardest, I'm always like the most pumped about because I know nobody wants to do chest ever. They're like, no, that's exhausting. Chest push-ups, it's too much. So I'm super pumped. I'm like, chest is my favorite. Here we go, guys. This is going to be your favorite too by the end. You're going to see how much growth you've made, and your last 5 reps are the most important, and we're going to do this together. But I think we need that same energy and spirit with the books that we're given. Besides that, though, I don't really have a lot of great advice, so I'm excited to hear what you're all going to share with us.
For me, it's my shoulders. Those are the ones that I always
shoulders are tough too.
Yeah, that's
yeah, okay. Well, if you were in my class, that would be my favorite for you.
So I think like at a very foundational level, I think like we have to be, I want to give teachers license just to jump in and start reading. I think one of the things that has happened to teachers, we talked about this at the beginning, is teachers have been told that we should be doing all of these other things in reading class other than reading. So we should be writing, which we love. We should be discussing, which we love. We should, be doing like projects and PowerPoint presentations. And what's happening
which
is
we don't love as much.
I didn't comment on that one. But what we've lost sight of is that the real work and the real learning happens in the text. And so I think our first inclination when we get those texts that we might not love as much is to actually like stay away from the text, right? We'll assign kids to read it independently. We'll hope that they read it independently. But if they don't, that's okay, because we're just going to talk about it the next day. So I think the first step is just really encouraging teachers to devote as much of their time in their reading classes to doing the reading, and then starting to think about how do we support kids in making meaning. So this is the real work of reading classes. And I think as teachers, even if it's a book that we don't love, first we should start to think about what makes this book challenging. What is going to be hard about this book for kids? Because I think that's sometimes the reason that we either don't love a book or we think that our kids won't love a book, because we're worried about the challenges that it will pose. And so then we need to start to think about, great, is it a knowledge gap? What's the contextual knowledge that I need to provide to my students in order to help them access this book at a foundational level, or perhaps to see this book in a new way? What are the vocabulary words that are going to be really challenging for my kids? And how am I going to teach those words explicitly so that the vocabulary doesn't become a barrier to understanding? And then I'm going to start to think about what are the different ways that I'm going to read this with my students to support them in reading this book in a more fluent way. So I'm going to do some shared oral reading as a class. I'm going to want to spend some time doing teach or read aloud and preparing to do that read aloud to really bring that book to life. And then of course there will be opportunities for them to do some short bursts of independent reading. And I think it's also, and so I think in thinking about what makes it hard and doing our homework and thinking about, great, here are the networks of knowledge that I'm going to build to give kids access, I think we start to understand a little bit more about the author's intentionality. We begin to see the book at new depths. I think we start to understand, this is a really interesting perspective, learning more about the author that I didn't know before. Now I have a clearer picture of why they might have written this. And then I think we should also just ask ourselves, what makes this book beautiful? And if we can't answer that question ourselves, that's okay. That's when, again, we start to do a little bit more research. So we start to read a little bit of the lit crit. Why do people love this book? We talk to our colleagues. Have you ever read this book? What is it about this book that I might be missing that I could share with my students so that they might enjoy it? So doing these mini book club discussions outside of class so that I can bring that joy and that knowledge to my students.
As Colleen's talking, I keep thinking about how hard Shakespeare is, but then one of the ways to get kids to love Shakespeare is for them to see it dramatized. Like when someone brings a text to life, you're like, oh, it's really good. if you read the screenplay of your favorite movie, you'd be like, but then the movie, then you see it dramatized, it comes to life, it's beautiful. And so I just want to double click on what Colleen is saying about the power of read aloud, that like stories like invested with meaning and brought to life are so powerful. One of my favorite videos in the book is a video of a teacher named Gabby Wolf. She teaches what's to us the equivalent of 11th grade at King Solomon Academy in London. And they're reading Robert Louis Stevenson, Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde, right? This is a really hard book, very complex syntax. You could imagine kids being put off by it. But the lesson starts just with her reading it beautifully for like 4 or 5 minutes, just investing it with expression. Like suddenly this very dry book is like come to life. And then she asks them to start reading a little bit, first in like pairs and then aloud to the group. And like they're kind of mimicking her. They're taking just immense pleasure in bringing this difficult book to life. So I just think like read aloud is so underestimated. And of course then they're hearing the meaning come to the book. She also supplements in a couple really interesting ways. I think that's one of the things that we could think about. She showed them, she was talking about Victorian sensationalism, so she showed them some, like, these are headlines from Victorian newspapers, and these are some of the things that were written about at the time. And so she's building their background knowledge, but she's also, supplementing. And if you have a book that you were saying, like, what if it's a book that I really, really don't like? You could always supplement with either nonfiction or other fiction passages that are similar. I mean, I don't know why anyone wouldn't love Number of the Stars, because I think it's a great book. But let's say you're reading something about World War II and you didn't like it. You could read aloud a section from Diary of Anne Frank, to like embellish it with something you really did think that was great that's kind of tangentially related to the book that you're reading. So if you're not crazy about the book, one, bring it to life. I would say try it, but then like you can bring it to life by finding related comparable texts also that might cause connections for students or for yourself.
I'm loving these suggestions because throughout this whole conversation, I was thinking about all those times that I would assign my kids to read a chapter at home. And, you have all over the place. You have some kids who come back the next day and they're like, I read the whole book. Then you have other kids who haven't read anything. And you're like, great, how are we going to have this lesson? You haven't read a thing. And you have everyone across the spectrum and you're trying to have this lesson. So I just love the ideas you're talking about with, keep it in the classroom. That's what the class is for, right? Like, let's read it in class. But then I've also seen, I won't say I've done it, but I probably have, where teachers are like just reading aloud just to get through it, or even playing the audiobook just to, well, if they didn't read it at home, they're not going to read it at home. So we're just going to do this to get through it. And I love the way you all are talking about these read alouds as being purposeful, right? So it's not like don't read aloud to your kids, but use it as a purposeful way of getting them into the book, getting them interested, excited, ready for this lesson, and then giving them their space and time to read it too. So is there anything else you all want to add about that? Just because that hit home for me, for sure.
I love that, Melissa. What you just mentioned certainly resonates. I as a parent, I use Audible as a hack for sure. One of the things I use it in the car as a replacement for devices, so we'll just listen to something together. But when it comes to the classroom, I think one of the things that Read Aloud allows you to do is do what we call knowledge feed. Whether it's just for vocabulary, right? So you encounter a challenging vocabulary word and you just briefly say that means X, which you can't do with an Audible, right? You'd have to be pausing it pretty frequently, depending on the book, to give that knowledge. And both Colleen and Doug have talked about the importance of preparing for us as teachers, even just if it's just rehearsing your read aloud and circling that vocabulary that that you might have to define for kids, and actually just jotting a note to yourself in the margin how you'll define it, because oftentimes when we try to come up with a definition for something on the fly, it's not as accurate as we might think it to be. And so I think that would just be one other additional suggestion in terms of how to increase the intentionality of your read alouds. And of course, obviously modeling the drama in that read aloud and that passion is really what's going to help it come alive, not to mention help it make meaning, right, for our most struggling readers. And that's usually the benefit of Audible, because it will lend that sort of spirited read that we might not otherwise be able to bring.
In the video of Gabby Wolf that I was describing before, she does that twice. Once she says to the class, I want us to read it aloud. I'll start, you'll pick up from, we're going to read it in the spirit of Victorian sensationalism that we know Stevenson was trying to achieve. So I should really hear the sensationalism in your voice, which to your point, Melissa, is like causing them to be like doubly attentive to the text and pull meaning out of the text and find the words that were sensationalist and read it purposefully. which I think is beautiful. And then there, like she pauses every once in a while to like drop in a vocabulary word or feed into a little knowledge. There's a scene where like the maid faints when she sees, the terrible deeds of, Dr. Jekyll or Mr. Hyde, or remember. Anyway, she pauses and she's like, she faints. She says, because she's just a woman, and like the whole class breaks up laughing. But now they're sort of more attentive to paying attention to Victorian gender expectations, and so like she even asks them to like play that up a little bit. So I just think that I love your phrase, which is like reading aloud, but making read aloud purposeful it's an exercise in shared meaning making. And it can save us a lot of time that we might spend having to ask you a bunch of questions like, did you know which words made it sound sensationalist? Because if you read it aloud sensationalist and you talk about, the body jumped upon the roadway or the bones audibly shattered, you've already shown that you understand. I also think it's really interesting. Those are actual quotes from the. I'm just struck by how well I can remember exact things that Gabby reads with her kids because it's so beautifully expressed. Like, it's weird that I remember that text so well just because she reads it aloud so beautifully.
We love read aloud, so is it okay if I jump in as well? And I think it's particularly important because I think that a lot of teachers assume that read aloud is something that happens in K through 2 or maybe K through 3, and then after that read aloud is done. And one of the points that we really try to make in the book is about the power of read aloud even through high school. And so as Doug was talking about the Gabby clip, it reminded me of another clip that we show in the book of Scott Wells, and it's a part of his lesson where he's really focused on fluency, and so he does a read aloud, but he is very careful about calling his shots, just like Gabby. So in this case, he says, as I read, I want you to pay attention to how I convey the emotion of the characters. And then they do a quick debrief, and he says, and now it's going to be your turn. You're going to use those same methods. And so they do a partner reading of the very same section. And so I think that like, here's a clear model, here's the purpose for the model, here's what I really want you to attend to, can make it a really productive and meaningful experience. For teachers who are interested in using read aloud, a couple of things that I think are important for shaping students' attention and supporting comprehension. So we talk a lot in the book about annotation tasks. And so for students who are ready to annotate, rather than just saying, listen as I read aloud, but if we say, I'm going to be reading aloud, and as I read aloud, I want you to notice any of the words that Lowry uses to show Anne-Marie's specific emotions in this scene, for example. And then also just pausing to ask kids what we call established meaning questions. So we want to pause to confirm literal understanding. It can make it a more active experience. We can then make sure that students are comprehending in the ways that we hope that they were, or the ways that we're anticipating that they will. And that's really important to do if it's a particularly challenging section of text that we've just read, or if it's a particularly critical moment in the text that we want them to be able to come back to and remember.
Yeah, so this is making me think about something else we wanted to ask you about, which is close reading. And close reading became very popular when the Common Core standards were introduced. And my understanding of close reading, I think, is like just reading a short passage and analyzing that short passage. So I'm wondering how you all see close reading kind of fitting in, like if we're reading these longer texts, is there still a place for this idea of close reading?
I think we really love the idea of pulling short, especially meaningful sentences or passages from a longer text that are really useful in helping me to understand how this text is making meaning more broadly. So I'm almost like digging deep into the DNA of like one or two sentences, studying them briefly, and then letting you kind of take and apply that to the rest of the text. One of my favorite videos in the book is one of a teacher named Jen Brimming. She's in Plymouth, England. We have a lot of American teachers in the book too, I promise you. But she's reading the beginning of Lord of the Flies. And if you want to gather your daughter around for this, Lori, it's the beginning of the book. I'm sure most people know the story, but it's a group of boys from a British boarding school. They're stranded on an island. It's just the boys. There are no adults. They attempt to recreate society. It looks like it's going to be idealistic. It descends very quickly into like the darkest dystopianism that you could imagine. And there's a scene where one of the protagonists, Ralph, it's really hot on the island. He takes off his clothes. And so Jen has like taken this sentence and she projects it on the board where everyone can like read it and reread it and kind of like keep it in their working memory. She asks them to read it, and then she's rewritten a version of the sentence that is slightly different. And instead of tearing off his clothes fiercely, he tears off his clothes eagerly. And instead of remember the other exact difference. I don't know, maybe you can see it in your book there, but she basically takes a couple of just word nuances and modulates them slightly, so you can see the foreshadowing in the word fiercely versus eagerly that shows like this the savagery beneath the surface of the boys and I. She just asks the students to compare. How's the meaning that's made here differently? We could spend a lot of time talking about symbolism, and but really, like, this is just an exercise in putting an important piece of text in a cognitively privileged environment where students can study it and go back and forth between the two and continue to compare them and study what I would describe as like minimally different examples, how a very small change affects meaning making. And this, I just think there's a lot of like cognitive science research about how powerful these ideas of cognitively privileged environment, minimally different examples are to helping people understand how a complex phenomena works, in this case, syntax and word choice. I think once you've done that, for the rest of the chapter now you're like, oh, that word choice, there's a lot of savage imagery in this book, rather, so I think that, I just think that's a great example of close reading. I'll let Colleen and Erica make a little bit more sense of it from there.
I was just going to say real quick, I think it makes so much more sense to close read something that they will have more knowledge about and can make more sense of than like just reading those 2 sentences and then never seeing it again.
Yeah. I was even thinking how that would play out for the students in their writing, that when students are responding to writing tasks about Lord of the Flies, that they're thinking about the words that they want to choose to represent certain parts. And if I had to choose between the 2 words that we were talking about in this section, which one I would choose and why, I mean, that's going to help me in writing, in both the reading and writing tasks down the road too, unrelated to this text, right? Because as a writer, I'm going to stop and think, okay, well, what if I use this word? Okay, what if I use this word? All right, now, what's the meaning I really want to convey? Okay, this word's probably the better choice. And I can have that dialogue in my head. I know you all have that dialogue because you wrote this awesome book, right? And Melissa and I had that dialogue both out loud and in our heads when we wrote our book too. You feel compelled. You're putting the words on the page. But why did the author choose that word, right? And I mean, it just levels up everything. So sorry to interrupt. I know Colleen and Erica, you both, I'm sure you want to say something awesome here too about this.
No, I love that. I think that's one of the important, Erica mentioned the indelible connection between reading and writing. And so one of the ways that we prepare our kids to be better writers is to give them models of complex sentences that are interesting, that have, sophisticated word choice in them, so that they can then, make those same decisions, or they're more equipped to make those same decisions when they're writing their own complex, sophisticated complex sentences with varied syntax and more interesting vocabulary words. So I love that point. I also just wanted to come back to this idea of one thing that's really important about us is that we're close reading in the context of books that kids know. In the classroom book, Melissa, I loved your point of like, they have more knowledge about it, so they're going to be more successful with the close reading, which is an important component of being able to successfully close read. I also think that after Reading Reconsidered, this was one of the misconceptions that a lot of teachers had, which was to choose a text simply for the sake of close reading versus this is the book that we're reading because it's a rich and beautiful book that we're going to read together. And there are going to be some exceptionally hard passages, or there are going to be some exceptionally critical passages that are worth further study. And so let's lift those and study those. The goal is to understand them fully and completely so that we understand better the whole work, versus let me find a perfect text for close reading that is actually going to be meaningless to you tomorrow.
And I would just add two other brief things. I think one of the reasons I'm really glad we called this the TLAC Guide to the Science of Reading is the power of naming that Teach Like a Champion has as a text and as an ethos. And the close reading technique that Doug described earlier, we call sensitivity analysis, and we actually borrow it from math. It's something that they often do in math. Like, so for instance, if the number was 6,485, ask a student, okay, how will this number change if we change the digit in the tens place? And so it's sort of the same idea, but applied to ELA. And then the other thing I would say is if you've ever been able to join us in person in our workshops, you'll get to see, or you would have gotten to see Colleen do a model of the opening paragraph of John Steinbeck's Grapes of Wrath. And it really, we often talk as part of that, the purpose of that is so that participants can experience close reading as students, but as adult readers as well, because it's a pretty complex passage. And we often talk about how the first paragraph of a book is usually pretty rich and worthy of analysis, and also oftentimes is foreshadowing themes that are going to appear throughout the book. So it's another great place also for teachers to look in terms of opportunities for close reading. But we hope you'll join us at a workshop as well.
Yeah, we'll be sure to link that in the show notes. We'll link information for your workshops, obviously the book, and everything else we talked about today too, like that Daniel Willingham episode that Doug mentioned earlier too. But such a good point. Yeah, I mean, teachers can take away some practical tips just from this conversation right here, right? So that back and forth with different vocabulary choices, looking for the first paragraph, the last really important places for those close reading opportunities. All right, so I'm going to bring it home for us. I have a really fun question to finish us out today. If you could each read an entire book with a class of students tomorrow, so just yourselves today, tomorrow you walk into a classroom and you're going to teach for the next month, which book would you choose and why?
I'm happy to go first on this, and I might have cheated because I just reminded myself of the books that we teach in our curriculum. And we've already mentioned one of them, so I won't re-mention that. As I mentioned, our curriculum is for middle school. So for the earlier part of middle school, I would love to read Wonder with my students. I think it's, Doug talked about the importance of reading books that were written long ago. This does not satisfy that. However, Colleen talked about the importance of bringing in topics that students don't know as much about. And I think what this book has is both an entry point, because it's just about all kids, but also the main character, August, living with craniofacial abnormality and how students respond to him, and just the empathy that you learn through reading the book. And so it really captured one of the things that we talk about when it comes to text selection is the importance of windows and mirrors. And so I think it both gives a window into someone else's experience, but also a mirror into their own experiences as they might be classmates of someone like this. So that would I'll only give one for now. That's my
I know it's very hard to choose. When we wrote that question, I was not sure if you were all going to be able to rise to the challenge of just one.
I suppose that's an argument for books, right? That none of us can choose, that they're all so meaningful to us that none of us can really choose the one that we'd most want to teach.
That is right.
I'd probably choose Lord of the Flies or The Giver. I just think they're spectacularly beautiful and thought-provoking books. I'll let Colleen take us home with the winner.
So it's hard. I was also thinking of Lois Lowry, Number the Stars, because I'm reading it with my fourth grader at home right now. But if I were going to walk into a classroom of students tomorrow, it would definitely be Bud Nut Buddy by Christopher Paul Curtis. Speaking of canonical authors, to me, he is a canonical author of youth fiction. Taught The Watsons Go to Birmingham when I was teaching middle school. I love that book deeply, and that was the one I was pushing for. The team decided it might be a bit of a stretch for fifth grade. So on our fifth grade curriculum list, we have Bud Nut Buddy. I think Bud is just so relatable, but surprising and complex. And given that it's set during the Great Depression, just an opportunity to build those rich networks of knowledge. And so I think at first kids enjoy the book because they're like, I like Bud, he's funny. And by the end of it, they just see the depth of Bud and the depth of the story that he's part of.
Colleen, I taught both of those books. Watsons Go to Birmingham is one of my favorites. But when I taught the Bud Nut Buddy, the kids learned so much about the Great Depression. It was crazy. I was like, and they were eating it up because they could also relate to him and his story. It was wonderful. Well, I think this is it, you guys. This has been a great conversation. Thank you
fastest
all so
hour
much.
of the day, for sure.
I want to keep talking to you all, but we have to end the podcast at some point. Yeah, thank you all for your time and your knowledge and your book, and we are so excited to get this out into the world.
So much fun. Thanks for having us. We're big fans of the podcast, by the way.
Thank you so much. It's been a real treat.